Welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, May 24th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Nikki Haley and her recent endorsement of President Trump in the 2024 presidential election. Now, you might have heard the news that Nikki Haley has announced that she is voting for Donald Trump in the 2024 race. In her first public interview since dropping out of the race, she was immediately questioned on who she was going to be casting her ballot for this coming November. And in it, she recognized a lot of the shortcomings of President Trump in her eyes, what she thought was the reasons why she ran against him in the first place, but said ultimately that President Biden was, quote, a catastrophe, and that she would be voting for President Trump this coming November. Now, I'm here to say, and I think many people have come to this understanding, that an endorsement this late in the game, and honestly speaking, an endorsement immediately following a primary challenge, doesn't always bring people into a collective party. What Donald Trump has shown over the past couple of months is that he very clearly does not care to win over the Nikki Haley branch of the Republican Party. And so when she decided to endorse him, many members of the right wing have uplifted this as an opportunity to bring in these voters that have been pushed away by the Trump campaign, pushed away by President Trump himself and his surrogates, that now may feel a home in the Donald Trump camp as they know the candidate they supported is now voting for Donald Trump. But that probably is not the case. What we know about endorsements, what we know about support, is that they do sometimes matter. There are instances where they really do make a difference. In 2020, when President Biden was endorsed by Senator Bernie Sanders so early on in the campaign season, it did a lot to bring in this collective Democratic Party. But when he made an endorsement of Hillary Clinton after the convention, it didn't make as much of an impact in the 2016 election. On the flip side, in 2016, many Republicans eventually fell in line. And of course, they waited sometimes even longer than Nikki Haley did, but ultimately came to bat for him in the coming November election for President Donald Trump. And so certain times, those things did matter. But the problem now lies in the fact that the voters that were voting for Nikki Haley weren't necessarily there for Haley. They were anti-Trump. It was different than 2016, when different pockets of the Republican Party found their candidates to be enthusiastic and people that they wanted to vote for, people they were excited to get out and caucus or cast their primary ballot for. People like Senator Ted Cruz, Governor John Kasich, Senator Marco Rubio, Carly Fiorina, so many different people that decided they wanted to run for president, that were inspiring niche portions of the party. And that isn't to say that Nikki Haley doesn't have her own core support group. There absolutely are diehard Nikki Haley stans who probably would support any decision she decides to make for a general election that includes backing Donald Trump. But for a good portion of them, many of them have already decided that Donald Trump isn't in the realm of possibility for them this coming November. And this endorsement, if we can call it that, really doesn't do enough to put Donald Trump ahead where he needs to be with these groups of voters that could very well defect and turn out for Joe Biden last minute and really drive home the presidency for President Biden. Now, we saw this, and the early warning signs really came to be earlier on this year, around January, when people were asking, who are you going to caucus for? But in the follow-up, if your caucus candidate, whoever you decide to support, doesn't win, who would you vote for in the general election? We often found that amongst groups of voters that were voting for Vivek Ramaswamy, voting for Ron DeSantis, voting for Doug Burgum, voting for candidates that were in this very big umbrella, Make America Great Again portion of the party, were very much backing President Trump over President Biden if the November election came around. But nearly half of Nikki Haley supporters in the state of Iowa said that they would vote for Biden over Trump. Biden wins that electorate, and he wins it pretty handily, considering that a portion of them decided that they were going to vote undecided. They don't know how they're going to go. And of course, a portion of them are going to back Donald Trump. But the fact is, nearly half of these Iowa caucus goers for Nikki Haley in 2024 said that ultimately, if it's a Biden versus Trump rematch, that they would go for President Biden. We also saw this starting to happen in states like New Hampshire and South Carolina, many of them who even now to this day refuse to bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump, even with the endorsement of President Trump from Nikki Haley. Now, I will say that a lot of the voters that were out there for Nikki Haley, to the contrary point of this, probably weren't going to back Trump anyway. He has turned off a portion of the Republican Party, including in closed primary states, meaning not independents who lean right, but rather, conservatives and Republicans who have been that way for decades upon decades. He has turned a portion of the electorate post-January 6th, post-2020 election, post all of the things between then and now that have made these voters completely against voting for him. Now, Donald Trump is making up these numbers in other ways. We're seeing that the big reason why he leads in the national head-to-head, we can actually see here, this is Haley versus Biden, a big reason of why he leads in the national head-to-head isn't necessarily just because conservatives are supporting him. There absolutely are defecting groups in this space. But because Trump is making advancements amongst different minority groups, amongst some traditional Democratic groups here, where you are seeing nothing to a point where he's all of a sudden winning the black vote, winning the Latino vote. None of that is coming on the national average, but minor improvements can move mountains in a presidential election that is already so exceptionally close. And so when you see Donald Trump making improvements amongst minority groups, and then you start to see a little bit of bleeding amongst conservatives and a little bit of bleeding amongst independents, it starts to balance itself out. And in some cases even, you find that with a youth electorate, for instance, that most recently has been starting to dip on President Biden in terms of support, you see that youth electorate portion of the poll does tremendous damage to President Biden and his chances at re-election. And so even though Biden might be improving amongst certain groups, even in another video today, we'll talk about how he has made stellar improvements amongst independents. On the pathway to victory if it continues, but the polls have been pretty stagnant over the past couple of months. I mean, I kid you not, you can look at the average here. The margins really haven't gotten that much narrower. There are different points in time where, Biden was very close to the lead, arguably should have been in the lead at those points in time, but now clearly is not leading on the RCP average. But the lead here really has fluctuated between, 0.1 to 3 points over the past 6, 7, 8, 9 months. There's not much movement here on either side of the aisle. And so that in itself is something that the Biden and Trump campaign need to understand. But the fact of the matter is, the reason why Biden is losing support is because of his base not really turning out for him in the way they are, in some cases, other Democrats. The same way you see in the generic ballot here where Democrats are leading. The same way you see in the swing state Senate races. Democrats are leading in every single one. I kid you not. And so it's very, very interesting that we still start to see President Biden do so poorly, but a lot of it has to do with the lack of support amongst that core base. With that being said, what does this have to do with the Nikki Haley electorate? Well, honestly speaking, everything. Because the reason, with all this bleeding amongst Biden's base, the reason why Trump has a lead of just 1 percentage point, when you're seeing, what could be some of the strongest minority performances amongst Republicans, minority electorate performances amongst Republicans in sometimes decades, depending on the poll you're looking at, is because of voters that voted for Nikki Haley, voters that are in that independent column that would have been entirely fine with her being president, that could not even stomach the idea of a second Trump term. And so you even see this too in the zombie votes, many of which are saying, Biden's not my guy, but neither is Trump. And this in some cases can be up to 20% of a Republican electorate in some of these states. Could be up to 15%, 10%. Everything matters in an election as close as this one. And based on where we are, the Republicans aren't in a position where they can afford to lose that much support. While they may be leading on the national average, the question comes down to, if Biden's base returns, what does that mean for the November election? Because Trump is relying on a cracked and fractured base that is decisive for Biden's victory. I mean, he needs them in order to win. And so Trump is relying on that core base cracking and the entire house crumbling. But the question is, what happens when Democrats lock up that foundation? This lack of outreach to the groups like the Nikki Haley supporters and this unenthusiastic endorsement that still wasn't going to do much because her voters here are really much more anti-Trump than she is. I mean, you find that a lot of these supporters out there are only for her, not because they love Nikki Haley, but because they despise Donald Trump. Even some of them were Trump 2020 and 2016 voters. And so it is that portion of the electorate that is largely being ignored. These zombie voters that are largely being ignored by the Trump camp. But you know who isn't ignoring them? The Biden campaign. Hours after Nikki Haley said that she was voting for Trump, essentially an endorsement of Donald Trump, a Biden campaign official held a Zoom call with a number of Nikki Haley supporters. They've been trying to court a lot of the top donors, and they have started to bring people in. People like billionaire Mark Cuban, who gave a lot to other people that weren't Donald Trump, including Nikki Haley, that are now all in for Biden. Because for them, it's no longer about policy. It's no longer about getting a Republican in the White House. It's about stopping Donald Trump. And they will do anything necessary, contribute, donate time, volunteer, whatever it might be. And there's a lot of them out there that were all in for Haley, but all out for Trump. And so that is a problem here that I think the campaign on the right has yet to understand, because they're looking at these polling numbers and saying, there's no way we lose the election. We were down 7 in 2020. We were down 2 in 2016. We won in 2016. We got 44,000 votes short in 2020, or maybe the internal Trump messaging is saying we were stolen, rigged, etc., or whatever it might be. And so they might be looking at this, and I think they are looking at this and saying, we have this election in the bag. Right now, they are thinking, this is a done deal for the Trump team. And so you don't see them making a concerted effort to win over, Republican primary voters from Nikki Haley, even the ones that are getting out there to vote when Donald Trump is the only candidate still on the ballot here, or still, running in this race. Nikki Haley, who has been out of the race for over 2 months now, is still garnering nearly 20% in a number of states, getting hundreds of thousands of votes across the country, totaling up to the millions that she has won in this primary season, winning hundreds of thousands across key and crucial battleground states like Florida and Georgia. I mean, doing very well in Republican primaries, when in reality, she shouldn't even be getting 1 or 2%, given that she's out of the race. And so what we are finding is that voters are using this as an opportunity to push back against Trump. What they're doing here is saying, Donald Trump is not the right guy for us. We're not going to vote for him. And so you see people like this, for instance, who talk about how Nikki Haley dropped out of the presidential race. As a Gen Z or whatever type of qualifier Republican, I won't vote for Trump. And it's so uniquely interesting because these are the same people that might have been upset with President Trump for not signing a pledge to immediately support the Republican nominee. But at the same time, Donald Trump did not either, and so maybe they weren't holding themselves to the same standard. It's so interesting to see that so many supporters of Nikki Haley just will not support Trump in the general election. And I genuinely have to ask, if Biden's base comes home, what is left for Donald Trump? Because this is relying on a fractured Democratic electorate. Rather than a unified Republican one with independents, it is relying on a fractured Democratic electorate. That's why Donald Trump wanted people like RFK Jr. on the ballot, because when you go to the five-way race, Trump's lead expands. When you look at who Kennedy is taking support from, well, most recently, it started to equalize out. When it started out in the race, 80-20, Biden to Trump. And so a lot of that support that was being pulled from, President Biden was helping Donald Trump, and it was a primary, not a primary, but a general election, pulling of those voters from the left. Voters who otherwise might be voting for Biden, but saw RFK Jr. as a Democratic alternative, not a Republican one. You also have to think about it too. From the lens of Nikki Haley, this unenthusiastic endorsement was probably what she felt she had to do to stay politically relevant in 2028. Had she come out and support Joe Biden, for instance, like John Kasich did at the Democratic Convention in 2020, he has faded into political irrelevancy on the right. And there's a reason for that. They don't reward people who defect to the other side of the aisle. And he did exactly that. He may not be a registered Republican. He may not be a self-identifying liberal. But what he did was publicly endorse President Biden. And his political career was over. I don't think Nikki Haley is done yet. While I don't necessarily think this is the viewpoint that she may honestly have, given the way she berated President Trump for months on end, I think she held back in this comment. But it was what was politically advantageous at the time and continues to be today. It was the right choice for her political future. But the impact of it is what we are really coming to understand. I don't know that this makes a tremendous impact on the regular election. I don't know if this is actually going to do what Republicans think it might. So far, we aren't seeing that many calls for unity following Nikki Haley saying she's voting for Donald Trump. You find that a lot of her own supporters are going to her comment sections of her social media and publicly condemning her, saying that she's selling out, that she's, copping out. She's not standing for what she had said on the debate stages 2, 3, 4 months ago. And for some of them, they feel very much that that is a fair criticism, even though they supported her and campaigned for her and voted for her and donated to her. They saw this as a breach on the contract they had signed with her when they initially supported her campaign. That she was not going to be this person who ended up coming back to the Trump camp. And ultimately, she is. And so I think for many of them, while there will still be diehard Nikki Haley supporters who can be swayed by the decisions that she makes, such as this, about who she's supporting in a general election, there are certainly those out there, the majority of the Nikki Haley supporters, who weren't necessarily there because they adored Nikki Haley, but rather because they despised Donald Trump. And she was the most viable option, the most vocal against Trump at the time, and so they wanted her over him because she was the alternative. I don't think those voters are going to be swayed by this because she doesn't speak for them. She doesn't represent them. At the end of the day, she was still and continues to be an advocate for Donald Trump, whether she likes it or not. And for many of them, that is an irreconcilable difference that they will not get over and will not be willing to back President Trump in the general election. And it will be interesting to see the impact of that this coming November, because although Nikki Haley might be voting for Donald Trump, a good chunk of her voters simply will not be. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.